I think a lot of people thought I was mad at first. When I went on BBC News, people were like, okay, so that I actually see something's real here.
You went from a 21-year-old university student writing a dissertation on asteroid mining to building the UK's first and only asteroid mining company.
A single 1 kilometre diameter asteroid can be worth £20 trillion.
Brilliant.
Trillion, yes, with a T. You're talking about centuries of economic development.
Space is humanity's greatest laboratory. Defense is democracy's strongest shield. And today, in workshops, in laboratories, in startups, a new generation rises, not to observe history, but to write it, where every innovation above drives progress below, where every breakthrough in defense preserves our freedom to create. Behind every breakthrough stands a founder with a story. Now these stories emerge to light the path for those who follow. Welcome to Rockets and Radars.
From university bedroom to boardrooms in Tokyo, from crowdfunding campaigns to £1 million investment rounds, I don't only want to understand the story behind Asteroid Mining Corporation, but also I want to understand the person behind this journey. From a kid from Scotland to someone who is literally planning to mine space rocks worth trillions dollars in the future. Before we get into the timeline itself, I would love to understand if you can describe us in one sentence, what is Asteroid Mining Corporation for people that might not know you yet?
Well, I mean, the clue's in the name. Asteroid Mining Corporation is a business which is working slowly but surely towards mining asteroids and extracting precious metals in space.
Now I would love to explore the other side of the things, the personal side. Who is Mitch when he's not planning to mine asteroids?
To be fair, at this point, having spent nearly 10 years doing this, there's not really a Mitch who doesn't. I do like to cycle. I do like to, be out in the countryside. But a lot of the time, even in the countryside, I'm still looking up to see what planets are where and imagining how much is out there.
Going all in, love it. Okay, great. Let's get into the timeline and let's get into the very, very, very beginning when you were writing your dissertation on asteroid mining. I'm very curious, why did you choose such an unconventional topic for that time while you were studying international relations?
Well, I knew I wanted to write about something that was interesting to me personally, because I thought this is the only time I'll ever write something which I actually have, editorial control over at university. And I was kind of racking my brains to see what I was interested in. And in university, it was when planetary resource and deep space industries were really getting started and kind of making waves. And there was a lot of press attention around them. And I kind of was like, well, there's no British companies involved at that point. I was also just really interested in kind of, the opportunity to get precious metals in space to have an economic and a commercial reason for space exploration. Because it seemed to me that up until that point, all the space exploration had been for the sake of science. But science is good, but science will take you there once. If you want to go to stay, then realistically you need to have some kind of financial incentive. And kind of the other half of my degree that was in history was very much centred around the history of exploration. So, you have things like the Lewis and Clark expedition across America, looking to see kind of find a way over to the west and build trails, find the Pacific coast. And then, a few decades later, you had the Transcontinental Railroad where you could go coast to coast in a week in comfort. So it's usually the financial incentive which follows the scientific incentive. And I thought we were at that moment in time where it was time to start building a financial case for going to space and staying there. And that's resources. If you can find the resources up there, then you have a reason to go.
For the context, we are talking around years 2015, 2016. Just out of curiosity, how was the asteroid mining market looking back then at that time?
Well, I mean, around 2015, 2016, you had lots of companies who were, you had planetary resource and deep space industries who were really kind of flying the flag and seemed to be like, this is the next big thing and this is the next big thing in space. So I always looked up to those two companies and I still do. But it was very much at that point, it just seemed like it was a natural thing, By that point, SpaceX is making strides, private space was really kind of starting to come into its own, and new space was really kind of, reaching that point. And it just felt like this is the logical next progression, sending private space flight, private or commercial space out past low Earth orbit, geostationary orbit, even past the moon and start looking towards kind of asteroid mining and space resources more generally. It just seemed and felt like a logical progression, and still does.
Let's get back into the timeline. So usually most students write their dissertation and they just go with their life. You decided to create a company based on that. Walk me through that decision. What was going on in your head, and have you always thought of starting a company after finishing up your studies?
Actually, I never thought of setting up a company. I wanted initially to be an airline pilot, but I basically I was looking for companies to interview for my dissertation, and I particularly went looking for Asteroid Mining Corporation, and just thought, well, the CEO of Asteroid Mining Corporation would be an excellent person to interview for my dissertation. That's some good primary research. That will definitely get me some extra grades. And I went looking for the CEO of Asteroid Mining Corporation, and there wasn't one. There was no company. And I thought, hold on a minute here. Asteroid Mining Corporation is it's such an iconic name. You can immediately know like what that company is doing and what they're going to try
Precisely.
to do. And I thought, oh, well, if there isn't one, I can register it. And one sunny afternoon in, I think, March 2016, I suddenly became CEO of Asteroid Mining Corporation because there wasn't one at that point. So it was a very organic idea. Thankfully, in the UK, it's quite cheap and it's quite easy to set up a business. So it was just something which I could just kind of go, okay, cool, I'll have a go at this. And then once I kind of had registered the company, it took me a few months, and then I started still planning on being an airline pilot even for those first few months. And then I got into flight school, but I had a 6-month wait until I could start training, and I thought, oh well, might as well give asteroid mining a go. And from that moment on, it was just let's keep going. let's see how far we can take this.
Yeah, very spontaneous for sure. I'm very curious about the reactions of people. What were the reactions of your friends, family, and people around you when you told them that you were starting an asteroid mining company?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people thought I was mad at first, so that was a fun one to slowly but surely chip away at. I spent a lot of time with people kind of looking at me, going like, "Are you okay?" But then beyond that, I reached a point where it just over a few years, people started to take it more and more seriously. I think when I first went on BBC News, people were like, "Okay, so that I actually see something's real here." But yeah, it definitely took a few years to gain that credibility, which I think wasn't helped by my age at that point, and the fact I'd never worked in the space sector before. But yeah, it was the first couple of years were quite hard. I don't think anybody believed that it would ever come to anything. But as a founder, you have to have that self-belief yourself.
For people watching this who dream big, like yourself, or who want to dream big, what would be your advice to them on how to prepare to talk about something so futuristic without sounding completely mad? I think in the very beginning of your journey, it was very hard to figure it out. But later on, as you got experience, I'm very curious if you got any specific insight on how to tackle this issue.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, there are people who are going to think you're mad no matter what. If you are innovating, if you're trying to do something differently, if you're trying to, do something which has never been done before, there will be people who inevitably think that you're mad. That's just part of human nature. I think a lot of it comes down to how you then go about kind of deconstructing the arguments, and also taking their kind of opinions on board. Some people will have an opinion and then it is completely, based on just gut feelings. They might not particularly like you, they might not want to see you succeed, and that would be a reason why they kind of diminish the idea. Other people would look at it from a technical angle and be like, okay, so this makes absolutely no sense. You might have not thought of like thermal properties or something, and as a result, it all looks very pretty on paper, but as soon as you actually test something, that it wouldn't work. And those are the good arguments, because those are the ones where you can start to learn from them. And usually if they come from someone who knows what they're talking about, then that's actually very, very good. And yeah, they might think you're mad initially, but then if you continue that conversation with them and you listen to that feedback, you take that on board, you almost treat it like mentoring, and you kind of action it, then those are the people who slowly but surely will kind of come down to what your cause is, and will start to understand kind of why you're doing this. And that's a huge part of the kind of the growth journey of a founder, particularly in those kind of early stages.
What's the most ridiculous argument you got when you introduced Asteroid Mining Corporation, and how did you react to it? Super curious.
The most ridiculous one's hard. I mean, the most absolutely ridiculous one was I had someone very convincingly try and argue that the Earth was flat, and they were absolutely taking no words to the contrary. I had a lot of weird conspiracy theories about space and the Illuminati, and it's like, yeah, I'm not in the Illuminati, so I can hold my hands up there. But I mean, on a kind of more kind of conceptual level, I think the idea that because something's in space, no one can ever gain possession of it was one which kind of really came about, and that really led me down the pathway of space law, and then starting to look at how commercial rights could be applied in space, what that would look like, what kind of frameworks and treaties that would operate under, and kind of starting to get to grips on the kind of the resource kind of rights and the laws around resources in space, and kind of working at how you would approach that, because that was again something which for the first couple of years there was absolutely no guidance on at all.
You mentioned BBC before, and I would love to tap into that specific story. So you were just 22 years old with a company that nobody really understood yet back then. And then in November 2017, you end up on BBC World News, explaining asteroid mining to millions of people. I'm very curious, how did you get to BBC World News in that very early stage? And I'm also very interested in hearing how big of an impact that coverage had on the company.
Well, the BBC World News interview was fascinating, because I was just going through my emails one day, and I saw BBC News, and I was like, oh, what's this then? And I got invited down for an interview down in London, and I was just like, would you like to appear on BBC World News live in the studio? And I was like, yeah, that sounds fun, I'll do that. So I went down, got an overnight coach down to London, because I had no money. So I asked them if they'd pay my expenses down, and they said this would not be a good use of the BBC licence fee. And I thought, well, I pay a TV licence, it would be a good use for me. But so yeah, I had to get myself down to London. I was so skint at the time that I actually had to stay with my ex-girlfriend overnight, because I didn't have anywhere else to stay, and I thought, who stays in London who would put me up for the night? So, I was trying to do this in the tiniest of budgets. I think I got up and down to London for like £25, and that includes the whole day. Whereas I spend that in less than an hour in London now, which is worrying. So yeah, I had to go down. I had to go into the studio, and then when I was in the studio, it was like, okay, so you're going on live, and that was terrifying, because I'd never done anything with TV work, let alone live TV. So it was all very much like a completely new environment, and I felt somewhat out my depth. But I went on, I didn't mess it up, and yeah, however many people saw it, and I thought that was that. But actually, it led to me getting another kind of piece on BBC News that came out, and that went viral in February 2018. I think that was the fourth most read news story of the day. And at that point, I think the credibility question was no longer there, and it was a case of, okay, so you kind of, it almost established me as an expert in my field in the UK, and as a result of that, kind of I started to get asked to do like more newspaper articles and things like that, and got invited to more events, got opportunities to work with more people, and that just really kind of snowballed things from that moment onwards. So that was amazing, obviously.
Okay, so media credibility is super important in the very beginning, especially if you are going for a long-term goal from the credibility perspective. Okay, great. And I think you wanted to take the advantage of that credibility. In 2018, you launched a crowdfunding campaign, especially on Asteroid Day. I don't know which day is it. Maybe you know.
I think it would have been June 16? June, I can't remember. It was a couple.
Anyway, curious, how did that go? It's a very unusual way to fundraise a first capital. So I'm very curious, what was going in your head? Why did you choose that path? And how did it go in the end?
So, I mean, the thinking behind it was, if we're getting good press attention, then it's a good way to, rather than have, an institutional investor who, puts a lot of money in, you can have lots of people who put, small amounts of money in. And I'd seen it work for other companies, so I thought, that was worth having a go at. Unfortunately, it was an unmitigated disaster. Obviously, I'd never done a crowdfund campaign before. I don't think I really realised the amount of work that goes into them, the amount of prep work, the materials you need, the time it takes to be able to talk to so many people. Because what I realised is that when you're pitching for institutional investment, you have a few calls. Usually after a couple of calls, you have an indication of whether or not you're going to get a term sheet. You get a term sheet, you have another couple of calls, and then there you go. You've got your money in the bank, deal signed. Whereas, and even if you're kind of searching for institutional investment, you maybe have to do 50 calls or 100 calls, but eventually you'll mostly cover your round. Whereas with a crowdfund, you have to take everybody the same. So it doesn't matter if they're wanting to put in £50 or £50,000. The dynamics of the conversations are pretty much identical, because a lot of the time you don't know until after the conversation. So it was like there was no bottom filter as to what the what the level of the conversation would be, and I found that just exhausting, and it really kind of put me off crowdfunding personally, and led me down the pathway that institutional investment is how we'll be going to raise our pre-seed rounds.
Yeah, tell us more about what were you raising for, and how much were you raising?
So we were trying to raise £230,000 in order to get basically the private capital requirement for Asteroid Prospecting Satellite 1. So that was a project that we'd been working on with Liverpool John Moores University Astrophysics Research Institute. We'd done a feasibility study. We kind of started working towards getting it kind of either on an ESA grant or a UK Space Agency grant. We actually applied to the Satellite Applications Catapult and Orbit Demonstrator Programme, and we're one of the finalists there. So we had this idea of having a satellite to go and look for near Earth asteroids which would basically contain platinum, and then build a data set out of that, know which asteroids are valuable, and then try and commercialize that data somehow. I stress that last part because that was the real kind of fuzzy part. Okay, so we get this data set which is incredibly useful, but it's useful to us, and it's maybe useful to our competitors who we probably wouldn't want to give it to, and that's it. It was not, I couldn't really think of anybody who would perhaps want to be buying this data set. And that was really kind of, I think, the stumbling block of this project, because it was a project. It wasn't really a viable business idea in the sense that it would kind of lead to a profitable return. And I think that really taught me an important lesson, which was, projects are projects, but business is business. And business is about creating a product and being able to generate profits. If you can generate profits, then, you have a viable, or even if you're just, doesn't even necessarily have to be profitable, but even just generating revenue, you are, already a lot of the way there. And that's a really, really important lesson that I learned as a result of that. So I kind of led us to where we are now.
Interesting. How's the company looking back then? Was it only you with the idea or the goal to build the Asteroid Prospecting Satellite 1, or was it something more in the cards?
No, so we'd grown the team to, I think by that point, 3 people. So, we'd kind of started expanding slightly. Everybody working for Sweat Equity, same as me. We were putting
oh, okay, so free work for equity back.
Free work kind of for equity, which I think in kind of very early stage startups is fairly common. Yeah, that kind of led us down kind of, okay, so how do we get this satellite up? And we were working with Liverpool John Moores University a lot as well, so that kind of gave us a nice project structure. They put a postdoctoral researcher in to work with us, Dr. Amanda Hughes. So we had a nice kind of mix of young kind of recent graduates and postgraduates kind of, and obviously a professor working on it as well. But again, it felt more like a university project rather than a pathway towards a commercial business. And I think that was where we're trying to bridge the gap, but didn't quite get there, because even though it was a very interesting project, it didn't really have that commercial incentive behind it, because who would have bought the data at the end of the day? You can't be your own customer.
How did you pay your bills? by the way?
I lived at home, which I was very fortunate to be able to do, and I didn't spend any money for a very long time. I was, I think, for quite a few years, there was a point where I didn't have any more than £500 in my bank account at any one time. So I got used to being very, very broke, but I was incredibly frugal and incredibly efficient with what I would spend money on, how I would get there. A lot of it went on train tickets to get down to London, to get down to Liverpool, and that was basically my main expenditure at that point.
Yeah, tell us more about that. When I talked to you the first time, I think 1.5 year ago, you mentioned this story about instead of living in London, because you were working and trying to find partnerships and potential collaborations in London, right? But you weren't living in London per se. Tell us more about that.
So what I used to do, which I think was incredibly efficient of me, so it comes down to the idea that I could get an overnight bus or the overnight train from Glasgow to London, and then I could get it back the next day. So that basically gave me one full day a week working in London. And then I would come down, I'd arrive probably about 7 a.m., 7:30, and then I would be leaving probably about 11:30, midnight. So it was kind of like a full, very busy day in London, and I'd do that once a week for, God, a few years. But it meant that I didn't have to spend money on a hotel in London. I didn't have to, pay London then or move down to London full time. It slowly but surely kind of started moving me down towards London, where I did eventually move a few years later. But it was quite necessary at that time to kind of live in Scotland and travel down, and it worked. It saved me a hell of a lot of money and probably contributed to the financial viability of the business as a whole.
Yeah, very impressive, and a lot of people could learn from here, like how much or how far can you get without spending actually too much. So you can pretty much do anything for longer as you did, and that's super impressive. Okay, let's talk about the transition between the UK and Japan, where you landed a partnership. Tell us more about what happened at that point, which is around 2018, 19, 2020 in the company, and how did you end up partnering with Tohoku University in Japan in the end?
So again, this comes down to kind of the BBC News pieces and the fairly regular kind of media attention we were getting. Because I mean that was pretty global by that point. Our name had kind of not just recognised in the UK, but had made it into kind of quite a lot of places and quite a lot of newspapers and internationally as well. So I get an email one day, kind of somewhat out of the blue, from a PhD student who happens to be coming to Glasgow. Dr. Michael Laney kind of says, "I'll be in Glasgow, would you like to meet for a coffee on, this day? I have this Wednesday free," for example. So yeah, I agreed to meet him for a coffee. I'm in London the day before, so I get the sleeper train up from London to Edinburgh, and then the next morning I have to kind of do a meeting in Edinburgh, and then I get the train over to Glasgow. So we're supposed to meet for coffee, but on the train over from Edinburgh, I'm just like, well, you know what, let's just go for the beer. Coffee's quite dry sometimes at the way. Kind of, I don't know why. I just had a sense that a beer would be more fun and more enjoyable for both of us. So I met Dr. Laney for a beer, and we had a beer. We had a chat. He had a nice presentation. Told me about Tohoku University. Talked to me about Professor Kazuya Yoshida, who I'd already heard of. Because obviously he's a very, very senior figure in kind of asteroid exploration and space robotics. And he was like, "No, I study under Professor Yoshida. I can, potentially see about getting a project going between kind of Tohoku and yourself. I really like the company. I'd like to be part of it." And yeah, at that point we kind of sat down and we were like, "Yeah, let's see how we can work together." So that kind of planted the seed, and then it took a few years from there. So I think that would have been about summer 2019. And then it took about 2 years from that point to kind of get to the point where we had a contact with Tohoku University. But it was kind of in that period, slowly starting to scope out what we would be doing. Like we had a rough idea of, an asteroid exploration robot, and an asteroid exploration robot that would, be able to climb over the surface rather than just, climbing over the surface rather than the traditional ones, which we'd seen before with like the mascot lander, which is almost like a trap door that would open up and then come back down. And, it's a very randomized kind of sample collection, randomized exploration tool. We wanted something which could do kind of targeted locomotion. So, you see that little crest on that asteroid over there, walk and get to that crest, because we thought that for resource operations, you can't just kind of, hope that gravity is going to deposit you at the right place. You need to be able to get there in a targeted and controlled manner. So that's where the idea came from, and having something which could maneuver over these asteroids and kind of get to resource sites based from a landing site. And yeah, it's kind of 2 years of kind of very, very preliminary kind of thought went into that. And then kind of some laying the groundwork for a contact with Tohoku University. Mikhail was finishing up his PhD, and he got the offer of an assistant professorship at the university if he could get some research funding in. And that lined up perfectly for us, because we were at that point now thinking about going fundraising, and we were kind of on the UK Space Agency LEO Accelerator at that point as well. So we'd had that kind of coachability into how to go fundraising, what the basic requirements are. Started to get the house in order, and things just lined up. We managed to secure a contact with Tohoku University. That allowed us to then go and raise investment, and off the back of that, allowed us to start the project in October 2021.
Awesome. For the context, by the way, Tohoku University is the same lab that worked on the HAYABUSA, Japanese HAYABUSA missions that actually touch asteroid. What I'm very curious about, as you being a UK-based founder, was there were there any guardrails that you weren't Japanese to land a partnership in the end?
No, actually, surprisingly not. So Japan's a very easy country to do business in. There's obviously quite a few kind of cultural quirks that you have to get used to. But I think on a ease of business level, Japan must rate incredibly highly. There's a very widely spoken English. There's a real kind of moral sense of obligation towards contract law. IP is very strongly protected. It's a very easy and safe country to do business in. So I didn't really have any issues there, and I think they were pleased to be getting research funding. We were pleased to be getting a very good deal on robot development, and this led to really where we are kind of now, with beginning to look at entering the Japanese market full time and setting up a company in Japan as well. So it's I think these kind of academic partnerships are a really good way for kind of startups to get their foot into a new market, and I would actually strongly recommend them, because it kind of allows you to have a kind of a lower stress level of entry, while still kind of starting to understand how the processes work.
You mentioned cultural quirks. What are they in Japan that you need to get used to get integrated into the business environment?
Well, I mean, things like bowing, things like handing over your business card with two hands like that.
Okay.
Just very simple kind of etiquette things, but it's kind of like you kind of have to just know them, and as soon as you know them, it becomes second nature. But this is all kind of part of the it's almost the little things which kind of you wouldn't expect that almost are the most impactful. Like, in the UK, someone hands me a business card, I'll glance at it and then put it in my pocket. Whereas in Japan, you sit and you properly stare at it for, a good 10 seconds just to really get the information and things like that. It's a lot of it's little things.
Is your company more British or Japanese at this point, by the way?
We're quite global. We're headquartered in London. We're very strongly Japanese, and a lot of our future opportunities are Japanese, both tech development wise and customer wise. But I think we are fundamentally a British company. It all really depends upon you can be a cosmopolitan company. We're already kind of across 3 time zones. We have a US subsidiary as well, so. The sun. There's always someone who's sleeping and that's always going to be an issue. But that's part of it's part of having a business across 3 continents.
And I'm curious about one more thing, culturally speaking, and that is the difference between the status of the space ecosystem in the UK or Scotland, for that matter, and Japan. What do you think, how those two areas in the world differ from each other, and which you think is more future thinking, and who is going to win at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, I always think Japan is a few years ahead of us when it comes to kind of the adoption of robotics, the way that they, think about space. They seem more willing to take risks. They seem more willing to invest in space. And this is a trend which I've noticed quite generally. I think there's a kind of cultural thing as well. Obviously, with a lot of anime and things, having space is a very a key theme in a lot of anime. I think that blends into quite a strong kind of cultural understanding of space in a way that perhaps we don't have in the UK. I think a lot of people still think of, if you say space or moon exploration, to someone in the UK, they'll still think about Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong. Whereas, they're not thinking about what comes in the next few years and what that looks like. So I do think that there's a kind of a very strong cultural understanding of space and, the benefits of space and the economics of space even in Japan. And I think as a result, that's led to things like having a domestic launch capability, having a very strong space economy, having JAXA sending the HAYABUSA missions up to asteroids and doing things which haven't been done before. And I think this is somewhere where the UK and Europe more generally could be kind of taking some pointers from.
If you started again, would you just straight away go to Japan to start Asteroid Mining Corporation? What do you think?
No, I think that the benefit of the UK is that there is, even though there's a kind of slightly more conservative approach, it's very good at the kind of the public funding ecosystem, and the university ecosystems here are fantastic. So having access to quite a lot of, universities, being able to bounce ideas quite freely off academics, is something which the UK is very good for. You can kind of reach out to an academic, you can kind of chat to them about an idea if it's in their speciality, and they'll quite happily kind of have a conversation with you and tell you, this makes sense, this does not, etc., etc. So I would continue to, I think, stay in the UK, but there's always, like, for young founders as well, when you're at the start of your journey, you like to think that you know everything, but you're going to keep making mistakes. So trying to make mistakes in a low pressure environment where, the worst case, you have to live at home for an extra 6 months before you can move out. That's a kind of makes your life easier. In the very, very early stages of a startup, it's about longevity. Can you let your company survive long enough so that you can, get the products down, get the, get investment ready, get that kind of project up and running, reach that next milestone. And doing that in a low stakes environment is always good. As soon as it's like, can I afford to pay rent next month? Or can I afford to put food on the table? That's usually when founders start to go, I'm just going to go and get a real job. And that's where, you lose access to potentially, game-changing ideas.
Okay, interesting. We'll stay on the topic of a product. Tell us more about how the product has evolved since you started the partnership with the Japanese Tohoku University. And I just wanted to get into your head and understand how are you thinking about the product once you realize that the first iteration, the astral prospecting satellite one, wasn't the way forward.
So when we wanted to do Asteroid Prospecting Satellite 1, the lesson that it taught me was, okay, so who are the customers? And I think that's a harsh lesson that most founders will inevitably find, particularly in the space sector. I remember having a conversation with someone who had specialised in, space station design, but they were British. So all the space station design jobs were for NASA. And he wasn't American, so he couldn't go and work for NASA. So he basically over-specialised himself into a very, very specific niche. And that's obviously a bit of a problem because you're not really able to go and action it. So that kind of feeds into this idea of, okay, so who are your customers? What is it you're actually going to be selling? And what are they going to pay for it? So when we moved on from kind of the asteroid prospect satellite and kind of started looking at robotics, it was a much easier sale. Okay, so initially we started developing a space exploration robot for asteroid exploration, potentially lunar exploration as well. But from day one, and the kind of the business plan, it was also, well, there's going to be commercial opportunities for this robot on Earth. Having a climbing robot, no one's ever done that really before. A free climbing robot that can, navigate rough surfaces and things like that. That was very novel. And obviously for us, in order to test its climbing capabilities, it had to be able to do it under 1G. So if it can do it under Earth gravity, then it's capable of doing it in 0G. So that led to quite a lot of kind of, brainstorming as to what the potential applications on Earth could be. Because we always knew that there were going to be industrial applications for the robot. And we knew that those kind of industrial applications would have synergistic kind of development opportunities as well. So that kind of led us down a pathway of, okay, so what industries can we do synergistic development, which feed into this long-term space vision, while also kind of, potentially openings up to markets where people are willing to pay for the robot sooner than we can send it to space. So that's things like the nuclear industry. You're going to need to have it radiation hardened to go into space. So, that means that, working in the nuclear industry seemed like a kind of a good idea. We also went down maritime because particularly in things like LNG tanks, the kind of the pressure, the heat variables, you can have very, very cold environments in the maritime sector. So this led us to kind of this thinking process of, okay, our North Star and the architecture of the robot is for space exploration, but how do we deploy it into kind of industrial settings?
Okay, super interesting. I actually saw your roadmap a few days ago, and it's interesting how you thought about applying the technology. So first try to really find out where the customer will get the most value, try to put it out there into industrial applications that you just mentioned, and then slowly get into a point where you can actually execute in the environment that you wanted to do it in the first place, which is asteroid mining, which is still a bit far, not that far as we think, but it's still a bit far. So it's a super smart approach that you chose for sure. Amazing. Okay, let's get into 2022 when you closed your first institutional round of £1 million from a Spanish investment company, E2EN2. This is a big shift from your crowdfunding campaign that we mentioned before. Take us inside that process. How different is pitching to investors versus the general public? And also I'm very curious to learn about the whole timeline of thinking about starting to get some private investors on board until getting that round.
So it was $1 million, which I think was £750,000, but it was just completely game-changing for us, obviously, because up until that point, everything had been bootstrapped, everything had been, skin of your teeth. You didn't look at the kind of the opportunity so much as how much it would cost in order to do it. So that kind of opened us up to actually being able to start doing R&D development, which was a huge opportunity. And yeah, I mean, going through the process of raising institutional funding was just it was an amazing experience. So E2N2 kind of reached out, sent me an email, somewhat out the blue. And I was just like, okay, sure, give this a pitch, see what happens. And, towards the end of the conversation, they were just like, okay, so how much money do you need? And it's like, oh, so we're looking to raise $1 million. And they were like, okay, yeah, we can do that. How much do you want? And at that point, I was looking for a $10 million valuation. They negotiated it down. So I ended up with, 7.5? £5 million valuation, basically. And off the back of that, it was just like, okay, brilliant. Here's the opportunity to grow and scale. We have particularly at pre-seed, you have about 2 years in order to get a product out. And also at that point, we had 2 years in order to start to work out who was going to buy the product as well. Because that's kind of that first change from, pre-investment bootstrap startup to post-investment kind of pre-seed startup. It's a big jump. And it's kind of like, okay, so we're actually working on a product now. Who's going to buy it? We don't know. So that's where you kind of start to go out and be like, who would potentially want this? You start to have conversations, you start to reach out. And, at that point, it begins a period of relationship building, where you're looking to see who could be your champions almost, and who sees the value in the technology and who sees kind of where this is going, at a point when a lot of the time all you really have is like maybe a CAD model or, a very, very early bare bones prototype. So yeah, that was kind of 2022. Beyond that, kind of 2 years late 2021, we started the project, and about 2 years later, we did our first unveiling of the robot at the Corner Space Summit in LA, and that was a wonderful kind of feeling, kind of actually being able to introduce the robot to the world for the first time.
Yeah, how did it feel?
It felt good, I must say. We felt watching it kind of, take its first steps, and being kind of, even without its casing on, just being in the room, and kind of the most exciting thing you could have there. That was great. That was incredibly exciting.
Okay, awesome. I saw one of your interviews when you mentioned that a 25-meter asteroid can contain around 725 million pounds worth of platinum. I'm very curious, how do you validate those numbers, if you mention them at all, to the investors that backed you back then?
So a lot of these figures came from analysis that we actually did with Liverpool John Moores University and the Astrophysics Research Institute, where we developed essentially a pricing model, where you would take the meteorites and you would cross-reference meteorite spectra with asteroid spectra, and then obviously the benefit of a meteorite is that it's on the ground, so you can do a spectrochemical analysis. You can actually kind of understand what the actual composition is, and then it's again a kind of game of matching spectras. If the spectra matches identically, then you can be similar. It probably comes from the same place. Or if there's some slight deviations, it's related. So this is it's not an exact science. The only way that you can prove it's an exact science is to get up there and then actually do the digging and cross-reference. So I think that's one of the long-term goals, is to kind of test out that assumption. But yeah, it kind of these numbers come from, okay, so if there's, for example, 300 parts per million of platinum in that asteroid, and there's 20 tons of platinum, and you can start to work out the kind of the mass, the diameter. There's a lot of calculations that go into it, but a lot of it really just comes down to kind of these meteorites, and that's why we now have quite an extensive meteorite collection.
I will stay on the topic of fundraising. Two more questions that I'm very curious about. First one, what is the overall bigger surprise in the process of fundraising? What did the investor cared about that you didn't expect?
I mean, they wanted to kind of see the timelines. So obviously we're coming out at the tail end of COVID when we raised funding. So we immediately came out of COVID and then went into semiconductor shortage, which was a bit of a challenge for us. And obviously, like, at least initially, it was quite difficult to get students over to Japan. In fact, the first time I went to Japan, I wasn't allowed to enter because I could transit through Narita Airport, but because I couldn't get a visa in time, even though I was applying for, I think, 2 months in advance, I still couldn't get an appointment for a visa in time in order to get a visa to enter Japan. So it was that was quite a painful moment, kind of touching the Japanese islands and then having to fly away 90 minutes later. But that was a part of it. But yeah, investors really kind of wanted to see kind of timelines, and I think this really comes down to kind of setting realistic technical milestones, and then also kind of going kind of stretch goals as well. How quickly can you get your product out? The quicker the better. That's the kind of the golden rule. The quicker you can have something that you can demo, the quicker that people can get excited about it, the quicker they can start to speak internally, and then the quicker they can start to go say, okay, so we want this, we can see where this one's going, and we want to integrate this into our projects or whatever. So that was kind of the main one. Obviously, like, they want to know what the money's being spent on as well. Investors don't just write you a check and then come back in 3 years and hope that you've done something. Or at least good ones don't anyway. So, it's about kind of building a relationship with your investor both before they put money in, and then, expanding that relationship afterwards as well. And I think that that's really a key kind of part of the investor relations as well. Just making sure that, person who's listed as your point of contact is, someone who you can pick up the phone to and speak to as and when required, or even just drop an email to them, and just, keeping them regularly updated, and, charting your milestones, hitting your milestones. These are all things that they like to see.
You mentioned that having, what did you said, flexible technical timelines, right?
Yes.
That was very crucial. What else would you say that would be helpful for people or founders now that are starting out more long-term businesses?
Well, I mean, if you have a 20-year vision and you start a business, then you have to find a way to make a business sustain itself for those 20 years, and that means finding something which you can sell, finding something which will make you profitable. Keep your 20-year vision. Like for us, it's asteroid mining, sending robots to space, recovering resources, bringing that back, starting a new economy in space. That's always going to be our long-term vision, but we have to be practical about the steps that it takes to get there. And also, I think, unlike some companies who really kind of go for broke, get to the asteroids or go bust, we don't approve of that model. We think that the overall journey is an incredibly crucial part of fulfilling that vision, and I think for us, it's very much based upon the tortoise and the hare. Slow and steady wins the race. If you can get to that end stage, you can be the one that wins, even if it takes longer, because there's a kind of mindset that everything's a race. You have to get out there first. Get there. Make your focus on getting there. Because if you're kind of trying to cut corners, if you're not really building a product, if you're just kind of being a project, you're dreaming. Yeah, you're not kind of reaching that final stage, because there will be failures. Space is an incredibly difficult industry to work in. It's very hard, and it's always going to have failures. It's always going to have things which go wrong. And when things go wrong, you need to be resilient. You need to be able to stand up and go, well, that sucked, but okay, so what can we do better? Or, how can we move on to the next stage? And that's something which, space founders particularly need to be aware of. You might have dedicated 2-3 years of your life to get that first CubeSat up, and then, it fails. Could be a minor thing that didn't work, or, it could be something which is completely out of your control. But equally, that still leads to the kind of same outcome. You're back to square one. You might be lucky, you might get insurance money, or you might have made a massive loss in that project and not be able to do it again. And this is where the ability to be resilient really comes in handy, because it's how you deal with failure that will ultimately kind of mark you out as a success.
Okay, super. Thanks for sharing that insight. Let's get into a huge milestone in October 24, where you announced having an MOU with iSpace, Japanese iSpace, for our lunar mission. This is huge. You're literally putting or planning to put the British technology on the moon. How did that deal come together? I would love to understand the very beginnings before even knowing each other, and how did you end up with that amazing milestone?
So, I actually went on a UK government trade mission to Japan back in 2022. And as part of that, we were very kindly invited to iSpace's Tokyo HQ. So one of the days was held at their headquarters, and that's met Jax there as well. And kind of at that, I'd heard of iSpace. I'd met quite a few of their people at kind of conferences and events. So I was very familiar with iSpace, but I never really had the kind of the ability to talk to decision makers up until that point. And yeah, from kind of being there, I kind of got the contact details of some of the right people. And when an opportunity kind of came down for us to potentially put a robot in space on behalf of a government, and advance their lunar ambitions, then I thought, okay, so we're going to need someone who can get us to the moon. And I immediately went, okay, so iSpace then, because kind of they're Japanese, so we know a lot of people at iSpace, are very friendly, and we've got a very good relationship with them. And also iSpace also spun out of the Space Robotics Lab at Tohoku University. So, in fact, I think some of their desks were right next to our desks. So, there's been a very long-standing kind of rubbing of shoulders between both our companies, and iSpace and HAYABUSA are kind of two of my very, very big inspirations for Asteroid Mining Corporation. So I was very much kind of like, okay, so they're a natural partner. And when I was in Tokyo, I had a meeting with them, explained the proposal, and, over the space of, a couple months, the plans were formulated, and ultimately it led to signing an MOU at IAC. And that was it was one of those, like, just excellent experiences.
Amazing.
Made slightly worse by the fact that my flight was very late getting into Milan, so it was quite a stressful day. But when that was signed, I was very pleased.
Okay, great. Congratulations on that. That's a huge thing to have for sure. I would love to now get into near term versus ultimate mission. So, Scary, your main product, or the main product of the Asteroid Mining Corporation. As you mentioned that you were looking into terrestrial markets or on-Earth markets first, so industrial applications and many more. And then you have this ultimate mission to actually use it for asteroid mining missions. I'm very curious, how do you balance those two things? Near-term customers, ultimate mission. For the prioritization sake, for the listeners that might be like, yeah, but so should I only focus on one thing or both things? Curious how you think about this.
Well, I mean, so for us, obviously, asteroid mining is the end goal. But, I mean, asteroid mining isn't going to happen in the next 5 years. What we can do in the next 5 years, though, is do continuous development and analogous development, working systematically towards the goal of asteroid mining. So that's identifying industries where, some of the certifications required are certifications that would be required for getting up in space. And, this led us to things like the maritime industry, nuclear, mining, energy markets. These are industries which are quite rapidly adopting robots anyway. And as a result of that, are in a position where they're kind of looking more and more at how to kind of move in this direction. So our kind of goal over the next kind of 3-4 years is to actually reach a point where we have shipyards signed up using our robots for kind of weld inspection and ships, because it's a good, harsh environment. It's a dangerous job. There's a skilled labour shortage, particularly in Asia as well. And it's a job with a very high fatality rate. So having the ability to save lives as well as a real kind of value add. So yeah, we're looking at kind of getting shipyards signed up. All going well, our revenue projections by kind of 2030 would be to hit 63 million ARR under a robotics as a service business model. And that would then basically allow us to be in a position where we don't need to take on round after round after round of investment. And then, you break something fails, you miss the asteroid by 100 kilometers and that's it. These are all things which can happen, and these are mission critical failures which you can have one, and people usually kind of pat you in the back and say try harder next time. Have two, you can maybe have three, but anything I think beyond three kind of failures in a row, and yeah, it starts to become very difficult to kind of raise investment and continue that progress.
And regarding investment and near-term plans, you're also fundraising at this very moment. Is that right?
Yes, we're raising $3.85 million right now to commercialize the robot.
Tell us more about who are you looking for? What type of investors in the geography speaking, but also their focus. And I hope that whoever is listening to this and is interested in supporting an amazing mission that Mitch has set a while ago, then I will leave contact details below this episode.
So yeah, we're raising $3.85 million or £3 million, kind of to commercialise the robot, both in kind of terrestrial markets such as the maritime sector, but also kind of continue development towards long-term space ambition. The development will be kind of using these the harsh environments in kind of industrial settings to prove out a lot of the kind of core capabilities that will be required for future space missions. So it's that beautiful thing where you can be making money to do a lot of the kind of the hard testing, rather than kind of having to pay to do that testing with no real benefit. So yeah, we're raising $3.85 million. We're geographically agnostic, so we're speaking to investors from around the world. Institutional funds, angel investors, we're very open to kind of conversations. I think it's kind of very much based upon the kind of the relationship that we can see with the investors as well, and kind of how the dynamics of that would play out. Because kind of now that we're at seed level, it's not just kind of investment based upon kind of products, also still an element of conviction, and building out a long-term relationship with someone who would be there for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So that's kind of the relationships that we're looking to build with our investors.
Awesome. So you can find the contact form in the description. And one more thing regarding talent, are you hiring right now, or are you planning to hire in the near future?
We are not hiring right now, but we will be hiring in kind of September, October. So we'll be taking on quite a few engineers once we close the round. So I would encourage anybody who's interested to keep an eye on our website, because there will be quite a lot of engineering jobs coming up in the near future.
Okay. Awesome. I will leave that link as well in the description. Amazing. One more question. So we covered the near-term future, industrial applications, commercialization. And I'm very curious, how do you see the world in 10 years from now, and especially from your perspective in the asteroid mining market?
Well, I can tell you in 10 years' time, there's going to be a hell of a lot more robots. They're going to be more and more common. And I think there's still a bit of a novelty. If you see, for example, like a Spot, or, if you see like a dog robot, if you see even like drones still have a bit of a novelty to some people. That's becoming very, very normalized now. And I think in 10 years' time, it will be incredibly normal to see kind of robots just doing kind of menial tasks and things that people don't want to be doing, basically. So I see that as being like one of the key trends. I think kind of on the space market, you obviously by that point you have commercial space stations. You'll also have, I think, a much stronger commercial space industry as a whole. There'll be a lot of kind of new entrants to the sector over the coming years. And in 10 years' time, I'm fairly confident that you'll start to see commercial returns of material from space. So you'll be able to buy something that was in space last year, be that a bit of moon rock, or some resources from an asteroid. So it's going to be quite a strong economic change, and I think in an uncertain geopolitical time, being able to have sovereign supplies of strategic resources, and particularly kind of key strategic metals, is only a benefit to the world. It removes any potential for blockading vital parts of the global economy.
Do you see Asteroid Mining Corporation actively mining in 10 years from now, so 2035?
Mining in a very small scale, but yeah, I think that within 10 years, 2035 onwards, we'd be expecting to start bringing back kind of material. Although awesome. It would be it's not going to be huge 100 tons. It'd be fairly small amounts to begin with.
Awesome. Amazing. Thanks for sharing your journey. It was super interesting. Some amazing insights as well. Now we come to the very last section of the episode with a few fire round questions. Okay, so first one. What is the biggest misconception people have about asteroid mining?
Well, I think the biggest one is that people think that you're going to add all this weight to the Earth and it's going to change the Earth's orbit. That was one which just came up a few times. You're never the amount of material that you're going to be bringing back from an asteroid is fairly small, and it's not gonna be changing anything. We're also not talking about redirecting asteroids. That's another thing that people get incredibly nervous about. We're more like a bee, kind of landing in a plant and taking a bit of pollen off and flying on.
Okay, next one. Let's say that I'm the biggest skeptic, conservative person in the world. How would you pitch asteroid mining to me?
If you're the biggest skeptic in the world, I think you could probably be persuaded by just the huge economic potential. When a single 1 kilometer diameter asteroid can be worth what 20 trillion pounds, can contain 115,000 tons of platinum.
Trillion.
Trillion, yes, with a T. So when you're talking 20 trillion pounds for a 1 kilometer diameter asteroid, and you think there's what 30,000 plus in the near Earth asteroids, it's 4 million main belt asteroids. You're talking about millions of small worlds full of resources which can be accessed and used by humanity. You're talking about centuries of economic development.
And a side question connected to this one, why we should mine asteroids if we can just continue mining on Earth?
Because you're outside the atmosphere and you're not polluting the Earth. This is particularly why I focused on asteroid mining and not lunar mining, because, people can see the moon in the night sky, whereas an asteroid is a very small rock in space, which is basically invisible to human beings. If you're changing the kind of structure of an asteroid, is anyone really going to be that upset if you're kind of taking material off it? Whereas, if you're mining in the Amazon, you're not sure about the impacts that's having if you're, deforesting and, diverting rivers.
The ecosystem.
Like it's ecosystem, it's ecology.
Awesome. Okay, next one. What is your most controversial opinion about the future of space?
I'm of the opinion that, Mars isn't as exciting as people think. I love the idea of going to Mars, but I definitely wouldn't want to stay there. And I think that asteroids are considerably more exciting. And the outer planets.
I can agree on that. I can agree on that. Okay, what is the best decision you have made in the last 8 years?
Best decision I've made in the last 8 years? Probably having a mentality if someone wants to talk, you always talk. You're never quite sure what's going to come from a conversation. So, for example, when I first raised investment, it was just sure, I'll talk. And I think as a founder, you have to be open to conversations. Just being open, being able to be spoken to, putting yourself out there, and letting people come to you so that you can have these conversations is always a really good part of being a founder.
And what is the biggest mistake you have ever made in the journey of the company?
Well, I've made a few. There's been the biggest mistake I've ever made. I've had some pitches go disastrously. I've spent a few months looking at something which went absolutely nowhere. It's hard to pinpoint one in particular, but it's kind of, again, it comes down to this resilience. If you make a mistake, if you've done something wrong, being able to pick yourself back up and keep going is key, because I think that's where a lot of founders inevitably end up going, this is too tough, I'm gonna go and do something else.
Okay, next one. For space founders dealing with very long timelines like yourself, your customers won't exist for years, especially on the space side of the market, right? Your technology is unproven in the space environment right now, and I'm very curious, what kept you from just giving up and getting a normal job through all of those years?
Well, I've never had a normal job. Having founded my company at the end of university and basically doing this the whole time, I don't know what a normal job feels like. I've basically always been a founder in my adult life, and I think the idea of a normal job keeps me up at night and is a fearful thing. I'm fully committed, and this is the thing. Knowing kind of what the potential of what we're building could lead to, just inspires me to keep going, even if it's tough.
Okay, awesome. And how did you keep other people not give up on the vision that you have set?
Comes down to a question of leadership. Keeping the vision clear, keeping the vision simple, ensuring that everybody kind of knows where they stand, and also when you're going into kind of new markets, making it clear that this isn't a distraction, this isn't a diversion, this is actually helping us get towards that long-term vision. That's really the key.
Okay, awesome. And 2 more questions, then we are done. You have joined accelerators across multiple continents. For example, Plug and Play in Japan, later Creative Destruction Lab. I'm curious, how do you prioritize those opportunities, and how do you keep yourself not end up in the rabbit hole of going to every accelerator is out there?
Yeah, I mean, you basically, I've kind of done quite a few accelerators, some of them good, some of them not so good. I would basically say never pay for an accelerator for a start, because it's something which should be free or should actually hopefully give you money, or lead to you getting money one way or the other. So prioritize based upon, what am I actually getting out of this? Am I getting market entry support? Am I getting, a small check of investment? Am I getting, access to some of the world's most accomplished people in their fields? Basically kind of look at what the program entails, look at what the costs are. And it's not necessarily a financial cost, it's a mental cost, it's a time cost. If you're spending a lot of time looking at working in an accelerator, that's kind of time where you could be working on your business in a different way. So you have to kind of really balance out, is this worth my time? And, is this worth the resources and the energy that I'm going to be putting into this? And then that becomes a bit of a kind of a balancing act. But if you strike that balance correctly, then yeah, it's they're very, very impactful if you get the right ones.
Okay, awesome. And the last one, just to conclude, for early stage space founders or people that would love to start business in this industry watching this, you have built something from literally nothing to doing potential lunar missions in under a decade. What do you think is the most important lesson or advice or wisdom you would want them to take away from this?
Follow your dreams, never give up, and be willing to roll with the punches, because you'll have some very good days and you'll have some very bad days. And I think that, the bad days will be incredibly tough. I've had days where there's been potential multi-million-pound deals just fall through. And you're just, that's a tough one where you have to just kind of, keep your chin up and keep going. And if you're wanting to, become a space founder, what I would strongly suggest is to identify in advance what it is that you are actually going to be doing and how you're going to get there. Because I founded a company and then had to kind of work out what I was doing after I'd done it. If you have a clear idea of, okay, so I'm going to do this, and then this is going to lead to this, and then this is going to lead to this, and then I can raise some funding, and then I can accelerate this. And that's having that kind of clear business plan in place in advance will allow you to kind of, avoid a lot of the pitfalls that kind of an very early, kind of very young founder will get into. But then equally, make sure that you're flexible and adaptable, because, if you have a very rigid business plan and then something goes on, you don't get that contact, then you need to be able to adapt to that. You need to be able to say, okay, so I didn't get that contact, but what about I go this contact? Okay, it might take us 3 months longer to get to the next stage, or it might take us 2 years longer to get to the next stage, but we're still moving in the right direction. And that's really the key. Just make sure that you have your kind of North Star, what you're trying to achieve, but be willing to, take the time to do what needs to be done in order to get there, because it's not an easy journey. It will never be an easy journey. If space was easy, everybody would be doing it. So, be ready to knuckle down, work hard, and hopefully you can achieve things which will advance the future of our planet and humanity as a whole, and greatly benefit everybody.
Thanks so much for sharing your journey and wisdom. It was very interesting, and I hope you enjoyed it as I did.
I did indeed. Thank you very much.